Good afternoon. I think we'll go ahead and get things rolling. Thank you all for being here on such a gorgeous Saturday afternoon and not out raking leaves or, you know, doing all those things. Um, this is our final public program in support of Clay Currents, the Wichita National Ceramics Invitational exhibition, and I'm Jana Irwin, the head of education at the Ulrich, and I'm very pleased to welcome and introduce today's panelists. Clay Currents exhibition artists Pattie Chalmers and Trisha Coates, our Clay Currents co-curator Ted Adler, who worked with Ulrich curator Ksenia Gerstein and ceramic artist and educator Brenda Lichman on this project, and our moderator for today's discussion, Curt Clonts. Pattie Chalmers grew up and went to art school in Winnipeg in the Canadian province of Manitoba. She received her BFA in printmaking from the University of Manitoba in 1994 and her MFA in ceramics from the University of Minnesota in 2001. Since graduating, she has exhibited in several dozen group exhibitions on 5 continents, in 6 countries, and in 31 states. She has also had 8 solo exhibitions in the past 13 years, most recently, Every Day I Think of You, which took place this year at the Red Lodge Clay Center in Red Lodge, Montana. She has 2 one-person shows coming up next year, including Every Little Thing, which will take place at the Craft Alliance in St. Louis, Missouri. Over the years, she has participated in numerous residencies, juried exhibitions, and has given lectures and workshops as a visiting artist throughout the U.S. and Canada. Pattie has also taught at the University of Minnesota, Ohio University, and at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale, where she is now a full professor. Trisha Coates originally hails from New England, where she received her BFA in studio art, with an emphasis in ceramics from the University of New Hampshire in 2005. She stayed in the area for the following 6 years, teaching ceramics at independent art centers throughout the Seacoast region of New Hampshire. She relocated to Wichita in 2012 to pursue an MFA in ceramics from Wichita State University, which she completed in 2015. She is currently an instructor in ceramics at Butler County Community College. Her work is represented locally by Reuben Saunders Gallery in Wichita, Kansas, and has been exhibited widely throughout the country, including at the Holter Museum of Art in Helena, Montana, the San Angelo Museum of Fine Art in San Angelo, Texas, and the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art in Kansas City. Ted Adler is an associate professor of art at Wichita State University, where he has served as the area head of ceramics media since 2005. Adler received his BA from Lewis and Clark College in Portland, Oregon in 1993, and his MFA from Ohio University in Athens, Ohio in 2002. From July 1993 to December 1994, Adler apprenticed with the internationally renowned artist Toshiko Takatsu. Adler has shown his work in over 100 exhibitions and has taught workshops at numerous ceramic centers across the nation, including the Archie Bray Foundation, Red Lodge Clay Center, Aramount School of Crafts, and the Anderson Ranch Art Center. In the summer of 2019, Adler completed a 3-month residency at the Northern Clay Center as the McKnight Artist in Residence. His work is currently on view in our current faculty biennial exhibition. And last but not least, artist and KMU commentator Curt Clonts has been an active participant in the Wichita arts community for decades. He was a member of Wichita's famous Dead Artists. He founded Art Soup, in which he would curate art exhibitions featuring working artists of the 90s. He co-founded the Tractor Factory, one of the seminal art studio exhibition sites in Wichita's explosive 90s art scene. Clonts also regularly contributed articles on art and music for Wichita alternative newspapers Scene and F5. In 2006, Clonts became the artist in residence at Friends University and held this position until 2013. He also founded the Ginger Rabbits Arts Co-op during that time. Articles on Clonts have been featured in the New Orleans Times-Picayune, the Dallas Morning News, the Wichita Eagle, Juxtapose magazine, and Punk Globe magazine, among others. Curt's work is included in the collections of the Wichita Art Museum Emprise Bank, Wichita Center for the Arts, now Mark Arts, and many personal collections. Everyone, please help me welcome our panelist and moderator for today.
Happy Saturday. Can you believe this? Weather outside, my Lord. So thank you for coming inside. We appreciate it. And I thank the panelists, the artists. Wonderful. The exhibit is called Clay Currents. I'd like to ask the panelists, what makes the works we see in this show contemporary? Take it away, Pattie.
Well, I think that if work is made now, it's contemporary, and I think about the title as being current. It's not necessarily now current. It's, for me, I think about the idea of currents of a river or currents paths. And so I think that leads you to start to see there's patterns and paths within ceramics, and that there's a very broad approach to using clay to make things.
Yeah, just to kind of piggyback on that, and maybe it's because I spent the entire summer building a piece that sort of is centered around the metaphor of river, thinking of the tidal currents. I sort of make that connection to, in a river, rivers all share three commonalities. They've got a headwater or starting point or a source. And I think of that in our field as our history. And there's obviously a connection between the material, but there's also a connection with the person you might have studied with or the process that can be a headwater or a source. And rivers are heading somewhere. They've got a destination, whether it's a lake or ultimately the ocean. And for us, whether that's a gallery or a museum or a table, and in between that space is the current. That's where the water happens. And I think that even though formally I think a lot of the work in both galleries might look really different, I think if we were to trace the lineage back to the headwater or the source, there would be a lot of overlap and a lot of common ground.
So currents in the literal sense.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So the history of ceramics is a long one. How do each of you contend with that history? I'm sorry, I didn't catch that. How do each of you contend with that long history?
I can't speak for my friends, and I'm really speaking more as the curator for the exhibition, but as a practicing artist, I find that engaging the material in a way that brings some kind of new perspective without leaving behind such a long and rich history is a rewarding challenge. But I think as a curator, wanting to represent so many different facets of ceramicness, and a big part of that is the history. Another part is the materiality. But I think the individual identities of the artists come through also, and I think being able to sort of showcase that and give the audience a chance to sort of take in a personal story, while at the same time sort of taking in the spectrum of ceramics. There's some very specific ceramic language happening in the show that people may or may not pick up on, but then there are also some pretty broad topics that are relevant to current events, and I think there's a really nice dialogue to be had in an exhibition like this, but also in an individual practice between what we experience now and what we know of the history of the field that we work in.
So I guess because I studied ceramics and studied clay, it feeds into what I do as an artist. It's not necessarily my starting point in terms of reference of what my work is. It is the place I go to. It's my studio, it's a ceramic studio. I use other materials, but it is clay first is how I that's the starting point, I guess, the headwaters in a way. But I think also that for me, even if you don't accept the history, or not accept, course you accept it. But as long as if you don't acknowledge the history in the making, the history is tied to it regardless. So whether it is specifically relating to the history in a reflection of that history, it talks of it sort of comes along like cans after a wedding car. You know, it's just trails with the work. I think there's a long history of figurative ceramics, and in the show I have figurative ceramics. But I also think about the idea of the body and that we're this vessel and that we're, you know, in a lot of mythology we come from clay. And so it kind of all fits together for me in this idea of being Prometheus in some way and creating man, or, you know, creating a life form. And a pot can be that as well in terms of the body of the pot, the mouth of the cup, the things that we relate to in terms of clay.
Yeah, I think for me, history is found in the process and the materiality in my work. I sort of consider myself a schizophrenic maker. I slip cast and I hand build and I dip and sometimes I throw. And within the materiality, like they said, you can't really get away from the centuries and centuries of makers that have come before you. But I don't look just to ceramics as well. I study still life painting. I look to sort of those traditional still life memento mori that kind of embedded in the work, the symbolism that's found there.
I look at clay as, I mean, I'm fascinated with it. I don't make anything in clay, but I look at it, yeah, exactly.
We'll get you.
I look at it as, first of all, the idea of anything like that wears me out. I mean, it's such a physical endeavor. And then there's fire. It's hellaciously torturous. That's the way it looks to me. I wonder if any of you were pursuing other art forms first before you made a jump into clay, into ceramics. Or did it just start with ceramics and take off?
I did. But I also...
You started with ceramics?
No, I started all over the place.
Okay.
I mean, I started with a BA in psychology and history and psychology, and nursing, and then printmaking, because I like to draw, and then ceramics, because it just drew me in. Yeah, so I've sort of been all those things. I think the idea of fire is interesting to me because some people, and I would think Ted is an example of one of those people, the fire is really important. I basically make my work in a toaster oven. I mean, an electric kiln isn't really, like, it doesn't feel like fire. It feels like, there you go, pop it in the oven for a couple hours,
Right.
and then it's not a couple hours, but it's different. It isn't about this alchemy in the same way. Alchemy happens, but it's not as exciting alchemy as a wood fire is, or even a gas kiln, which I sometimes use, but not that often for my work. So I don't think I was enamored by the magic of ceramics as much as I was by the form, and that you could make 2-dimension, 3-dimension, or 3-dimensional, and that you could engage it in a different way. And then I could talk about 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions and actually kind of play with those ideas. And that's what was interesting to me.
Yeah, no, I knew from the first time that I put my hands in the material, that's what I wanted to do at 15 years old. And that, of course, looks really different over the decades. But it really was just the malleability of the material and the physicality of it, too. I think it's a very labor-intensive material, and I like that about the field. It requires labor, and it gets me on my head. In my process in particular, I've got moments that happen. That's probably me, sorry. Moments that happen that become almost a repetition or a meditation of sorts, and it's kind of an important part of the work to kind of let your body take over and have that physicality.
Fantastic. Pattie, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'll go ahead and chime in there. It wasn't until college that I started to do clay as anything other than like an activity. I did it as a kid at summer camp. And so that really was my entry point into art. And so from there, exploring and discovering, my curiosity has taken me a lot of other places. But for me, clay is sort of home in that sense. I like to wander around a little bit. And I think, like a lot of people that come to art that way, through a more ceramics training, I would say I feel like I take less for granted in terms of the role of my field, my discipline, my medium, relative to others. And which is a good thing for me because it gives, I think, a vantage point that, like I said, it doesn't take things for granted. So when we explore ideas, I think there's maybe a little more opacity to the material because we're coming to it from a perspective that isn't really well covered as a perspective in sort of the art historical canon. And so for me, I've never developed a lot of skill in other media necessarily. I've got lots of ideas that go other places, but clay is always home. And it's partly because of what I know how to do with it and what it allows me to do, but also because I think I have that relationship to it as sort of the base of operations for my ideas.
Fantastic.
I just want to add one more thing to that. I think in that same way that Ted's talking about clay being his home, I go to clay and that's my comfort zone. I can do other things and I have. But I think that for me, narrative is my home. So everything kind of comes from this place of telling a story in some way. And so it becomes whether it's a plate or an object or a sculpture or a figure or a drawing or a video, it's all tied by that one thing. So I can have a solo show that looks like a group show.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, the material itself has meaning. I mean, I think about how the material relates to the ideas in my work, the impermanence of memory, these things that are always in flux, and to have a material that can go from malleable to rigid, that is both strong and fragile, that has qualities that are liquid and solid, I think make it a really fitting material for the idea in a way that maybe others wouldn't necessarily.
And I'm going to say, like the idea of unpacking your work where there is so much imagery that we can read, and we don't really need a reference point in the material to read it, but then you can also enter into that work through the essence of that materiality, the fragility, right? But also I'll say the liquidity. I mean, so many different states of the material. So the material is just permeating the entire image that you're looking at. And so you kind of move in and out between things that you recognize as images and things that you recognize as material in different stages of that.
Yeah, that's a really important aspect of it for sure. Thanks.
Yeah. I think that's something, the ability to unpack meaning through the material that way, the way that you use it, I think is not always something that I see in other material.
Pattie has a piece in the show called That Day. Did everyone happen to see the show and notice the female form with the red dress on, the human form? I love your earthenware human forms. You have That Day, and you'll also have Brownie with Stone. Both of those I noticed wear Band-Aids. There's a Band-Aid on that woman's foot, or that girl's foot, that female's foot, and there's one on the Brownie's knee and hangs on the wall. I think your work has a definite edge. Where did that edginess come from? I mean, can you pinpoint any one thing, or?
I grew up in Winnipeg. That kind of did it, I think. I mean, the things happen in your life that make you look at life differently. I think of it as ennui. I think of it as like the sort of pathetic loser. We were talking yesterday, or I was talking yesterday with a grad student, Chris, wherever you are, Chris, about superheroes. And I was more of a Marvel girl than a DC girl when I was growing up, because Marvel had all those heroes that were so misunderstood. Like that Silver Surfer, oh my God, he wanted to be good. Yeah, he wanted to be good, but he was kind of bad sometimes in the beginning, and he was so misunderstood, and he was so complex. And to me, that was just like, that's the layers, right? And I thought DC almost seemed, not to get all critical about comics, but it just seemed like it was more two-dimensional in terms of like good and bad. It's changed, both of those comic brands, but back in the day, that was the difference. back in my day. And so I think about that with my work, is that it comes from a place of that not everything is simple, not everything is straightforward, and sometimes there's beauty in pain. I mean, I grew up in Winnipeg. It's freakishly cold up there, but it's so beautiful. It's like this blinding white snow and this blue sky with suns that burn your retinas. It's gloriously, hatefully cold. It's gloriously, painfully beautiful, and it's also awful, just awful, but
Pattie
beautiful.
should be a writer. Don't you all agree? Such beautiful descriptions. Seriously. And I noticed another thing about the work, and I think you planned this yourself, but you place that particular figure by a vent or a fan so that the hair and the grass can move.
Yeah, well, I think about, so for me, it's about you. So that piece is not necessarily about a girl in the wind. It's about the memory. It's about being taken back to that moment that you felt the wind and the sun in that way when you close your eyes, when you feel that wind. For me, it's also the idea of hearing a white-throated sparrow. I'm taken to a place and a time from when I was a certain age. And so automatically I'm there. And that's what it's about for me. It's not about a depiction of a specific girl. It's about that idea of being transported back to that place of memory.
Well, I'll tell you something real quick. Midweek, I texted my daughter-in-law and I asked, she told me that she was going to bring herself and our two granddaughters to this show. So I texted her and I asked if they were here, and she said, yes, we've been here 45 minutes, and the entire 45 minutes, my 7-year-old granddaughter, Veda, did nothing but stare at that piece. She walked around it, she looked at it. When the wind blew, she noticed it. She found the Band-Aid, which isn't hard or easy to find, and she wanted to meet you, but she couldn't be here today. So yours is the only piece in the show she cared about. And I don't know about you guys, but when a 7-year-old speaks, it's usually pretty brilliant. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Trisha, your work has been described as ceramic collage. And Letter to My River blew my mind. I walked in there, and just the breadth of that piece, I mean, the absolute length of the piece is astounding, but when the eyes begin to focus and see the elements in that piece, I'm like, pow. It's like, how in the hell? What took you down a road that is so detailed? And how do you keep your sanity?
That last question, I'm not sure that I do, so I'm not sure that I can answer that. So my work sort of umbrellas under the idea of memory as being impermanent and fluid and always changing, not this fixed idea. We don't go back and retrieve it like a filing cabinet out of our brains. It's a protein that's stored in the brain that actually is put into a space where it's susceptible to change every time that we're recalling something. So it really then memory becomes about a construction or a reconstruction of the past that's sort of influenced by where we are in the present. And sort of to relate it back to the idea of collaging. Collaging is just cutting and pasting, right? It's taking imagery or source material from other places and amalgamating it together into one unified composition. And to me, that's how memory works. It's disruptive in a way. You know, it for better or worse, it kind of jumps into your brain through objects or smell or touch or memory or taste, you know, can trigger that idea. And it comes into play. I look back to a quote by the writer Rebecca Solnit, and she says, memory is a shifting, fading, partial thing, that it doesn't capture all of the fishes, and sometimes it captures butterflies that are unseen. And so I think when you're making work about memory, I'm not so interested in capturing the fishes. I'm not really interested in creating a truth, so to speak. There are truths in it, but it's not about creating a likeness. Right? It's about telling a story, essentially. I'm much more interested in those unseen butterflies that get captured while we're recreating the story. The piece in the other room is definitely more narrative than I'm used to working. When I was building it, I did sort of think of it as moving from a starting point on the left, like you would a book, and moving through that literal outline of a river, that black glass that's embedded behind the piece actually is an aerial view of the Lamprey River, which is where we were living when our child was born almost 14 years ago, which seems weird to say at this point. And so as you sort of move through that space, things jump out and disrupt and connect and grow, and there's loss too. I mean, you end at a space that you didn't start from, so to speak. But honestly, I have to admit too that like when I hear the word collage, it makes me bristle just a little bit. And I think that comes from, we were talking about this the other day, it comes from sort of the history and the baggage that comes with process and making. It's like, no, I make all that material, I'm building the molds and I'm creating the imagery and I'm dipping the objects and transforming them, I think sometimes in a different way than a collage artist may work. Sort of a double-edged sword a little bit, that relationship.
Okay. Hey, Ted, I look at your work. My wife and I, we collect, among other clay works, we collect specifically Japanese pieces from Yomitan and some centuries-old villages in Okinawa. And when I look at your work, I can't help but see Japan in your work. I mean, can you expound on that?
They say you never forget your first love, and I guess for me that was Tamba pottery from the Japanese Momoyama era. Or actually, I guess it was maybe the Muromachi, which was a little bit before that. These were wares that were made by farmers. Prior to that, sort of my teacher in college and his teacher before him were sort of more Bauhaus influenced. So, very European, very modern. And then through that, and sort of studying history, I also became interested in Chinese bronzes, which are very sort of more precise in their execution and their lines. And so when I came across, it was a book by an artist named Daniel Rhodes, who had visited Tamba and wrote a book about it, and a little bit about the technology, the wood firing. And it just sort of like, it lit something up, I mean, to use the metaphor. It was so different aesthetically, the way that the material was handled, the whole notion of aesthetics was really different than every model that I had seen before that. So that captured my interest. And this was in the middle of my thesis year, my BFA thesis. So it really threw me off track for a little bit. But I would say, from there being interested in that, I sort of pursued more of an emulative approach to it. I was making pots that sort of looked much more like the pots that I was seeing from Japan. And slowly over time, I sort of was able to kind of entrain more of my own voice and realize that it was less about the utility or the history or the tradition that interested me, and more the sort of abstract language that I learned was used by mostly connoisseurs in Japan to talk about the effects. And so there's a particular, in one particular case, there's a sort of a greenish translucent glass that forms from the melting of ash. And I won't get too far into the technical process of the wood fire. But it's a glass that forms just from the molten wood ash from the firing, and the translucency of it. The idea is that the most exquisite works, that effect would remind one of walking outside on a spring day after a rain. Right. So there's a very specific sort of emotional experience that natural phenomena of melting material in a kiln evokes. So that was really, for me, a very meaningful way to understand content in work that is really sort of focused on material and form. It's very formal, and yet
what should one call you? Should they call you a ceramics artist, a potter? Do you find offense with that title?
Maybe at one time I would have. I think I told my mom early on, like, I'm not an artist, I'm a craftsman. I was very serious about it. And then that changed for me later. And I think for a while I felt like craft was more about sort of executing a design well without flaw. And I think partly I was never really that good at it. I didn't have that sort of manual dexterity to be that good of a craftsman. So maybe that helped change my thinking as well. At this point, I'm really more interested in the ideas. I think, whether it's ceramist, ceramicist, ceramic artist, potter. I mean, I pretty much call everything a pot.
Well, you brought up something that kind of springboards into another question. As a painter, I find accidents to be fortuitous. Some great things come out of accidents. Can any of you explain one time where a complete accident with clay resulted in fortuitous discovery for you? Was there an explosion? Did something happen that kind of changed your course?
No.
I mean, yeah, I don't know. My work goes into the kilnish shards and it comes out of the kilnish shards, so it's sort of like failure and accidents are sort of part of the process there. Yeah, I don't know. Ceramics, lessons in controlled failure, it's sort of embedded into the material.
Yeah, I mean,
Accidents are gonna happen.
what ceramic artist doesn't walk around going, ceramics?
Yeah. I always,
Everyone does. Like, I think it's this love-hate, right? You have to love it enough to live through hating it, to stick with it.
that's so true.
Right. But then there's that thing where you go like, sorry, and then you go like, wait a minute, like maybe I need to pay attention to that.
Yeah, no, for sure, for
Right.
sure. Like, but it's like it's always vexing you, but it's also like giving to you. I mean, if it was always the worst, you wouldn't do it anymore. But I don't feel like I don't think there's anything. It's not like that moment for me, at least, of like I went, oh, this thing blew up. I think sometimes having to work quickly and then just putting things together differently than I would, or like making choices because of time constraints, or making things because someone gave me a show title that I hated and I had to figure out how to make work that I can fit into this theme because I need to get that state, because I have to show in every state. I'm still working on it. So I think that's more what kind of moves things in new directions that I wouldn't have expected, more so than like something exploding or having those things happen.
Well, and I think for me, I realize more and more that it matters less and less what we call ourselves as clay artists, or whether a painter calls themselves a painter, or because I
Just
think
artists.
well, less than. I still think that sort of frames it into like you're this or you're that, and I think there are people that do these kinds of things, an activity that falls into the realm of art. I mean, is it purposeful in any other way? What market? I mean, we're talking about a market. We're talking about a category of objects and material culture. We're talking about personal identities. And so I think, there are people that do this kind of stuff that are trying to figure out something that they're aware of, right? They have this internal sense of like, I've got to, no, that's not it. I got to do better, right? Then there are people who are like, dang, I am really good at this. I'm going to do another one. And I think there are painters like that, painters who are just really enjoy their own talent and go, I'm going to paint this thing, and I can paint 100 of these things. I'm so good at it. And, Thomas Kincaid, right? He's not trying to crack
Ross.
open any...
Bob Ross.
Hey, don't bust on Bob Ross. No thank you. But they're not trying to crack open any sort of... Like, they kind of already know, and they do it so well. Are they not artists? Are they craftspeople? I don't know. And then there are potters, and there are some in the other room there. If you guys go through that room and you look at the things that we think of as functional, if you think of the person making that work and what they're chasing down, what specific aspect they're trying to sort of crack open to unlock the secrets of, that gives feedback to themselves as makers, that sends them back to the next. And that's the thing, like that discovery, that accident. Like, I don't know anybody that thinks of themselves as an artist that doesn't sort of discover something that was unintentional, that they don't go, oh, that's it. Oh, now I know what I got to do.
Right.
Right. There's that aspect of it, and I think that's a different thing than potter, craftsman, artist. Right.
Right. Now, you brought up something earlier. You used the word marketing or market. And discussing money and sales in art is dreadful at best. I hate it. But it does exist. For years, ceramics were unfairly lumped into decorative art sales rather than fine art sales. Christie's auction house has an expert named Leonie Moore, and she has said that such designations are blurring now because young contemporary collectors don't sift or rank artwork strictly on medium anymore. Is this true where you live and work? Are you finding more avenues for moving your work financially than you did before because of young buyers? Have you seen any change? Christie says you have.
I'm thinking whether I want to think about that locally, like the audience here, people that we know, that we work with. And on that front, I will say that I find less distinction in the audience and more distinction among the practitioners, right? I think that you think of yourself as a painter. I think of myself as a clay person. Like we are, because of our training, because of our identities and how we define ourselves relative to other things that we see going on, lots of overlap. I think there's a lot of collegiality and sharing and interest in what each other does. But I think our audience is less like, oh, well, what's that doing here? That's clay, right? And it's more like, oh, well, tell me about what you're doing, right? So I don't think I see that in our market. Of course, it's not like the blue chip selling market that I run in.
One thing I have seen is I've seen the prices of clay works go up. And I'm thankful for that. As a collector of clay, and I'm not even talking about the money aspects of any of this, I just want it to get, and has always deserved to get, its due. And so it does my heart good to walk into Reuben Saunders locally and see clay works that are going for more money. I still don't think they get what they should. But
I was thinking of Reuben when you said that. I think Reuben brings a real business acumen to it, and he is a ceramics collector first, right? If you guys know Reuben, and he's been great with our students, and we have a great relationship. WSU does with Reuben Saunders Gallery, and so he's been very supportive in helping people understand as artists the shifts that we also see nationally, which is okay. If you're going to go into this gallery and show it these artists, then this is the market value that the work that was already there is at. You can't come in here. And so I think there's, on one hand, it's the realization that like, wow, that idea is really great. Who cares what it's made out of? As well as like, hey, this thing has to be sold with these other things, so we have to price it accordingly. So I think there's like a two-tier aspect to that. Mm.
I Googled who are the most famous ceramics artists, just that simply. And I see Peter Volkos, I see Grayson Perry, Toshiko Takezu, Kenneth Price, well-known names, but the first name listed was Pablo Picasso. That was the first name listed. And I have to tell you, that bothered me. That drove me nuts. And maybe it's Pablo's incredible ego or all of his sharp angles in his paintings. I don't know. And I love Picasso. But it bothers me that Picasso's listed first in that line. Comments?
I'm not bothered. We were talking about this the other day, the idea of like what's accessible and what people consider art and what people consider allowable in art and styles. And the people who have gotten New York acclaim for doing ceramics but don't necessarily have a ceramic training. And I don't know, like I guess I hit a certain age. I'm not an angry young woman anymore. I feel like there's this quality to accepting while still striving to be accepted. I don't think that it hurts us to have Picasso listed as a famous ceramic artist. He did ceramics. He didn't make them. I don't care, though. How much do you have to actually do? Like, do you have to mix your own paints to be a painter? Do you have to mix your own glazes? Like, people who do ceramics, some people use bought things, like commercial glazes. Some people use... mean, do I have to use all clay? Do I have to make clay hair to be
Do
a
you
ceramic
dig your own
artist?
clay? Do you ever dig your own clay?
No, but you'll get me into my discussion about Marxism, so don't take me there.
Coffee later.
But I do think this idea of like, well, isn't there room for everyone in this world? And I think that maybe the art world operates in the sense of exclusion because it makes things more valuable and less valuable. They create these standards and these rankings. But I think ceramics also has created its own sense of like itself in this world where there are ceramic galleries and ceramic magazines and ceramic things. I mean, a lot of mediums do. Metals does that. I work at a school where there's a lot of craft. So we have blacksmithing, small metals, glass, and ceramics. And so to me, the idea of craft isn't a problem. I think the problem with people thinking that craft is less is that they aren't thinking of craft as a verb as I do. They think of craft as a noun. And they're just wrong-headed, I think. But it doesn't make me angry or upset. It just makes me go, oh, they just need to learn that. They'll eventually learn it. They'll know it. They'll see what people do, or they'll just miss out because I think there's a lot of really great things going on in ceramics. I don't get all like.
Yeah, I don't know that it does our field any good to draw hard dividing lines.
As my dad says, don't get yourself wrapped around your own axle.
I like that.
I think it's a case of rewritten and omitted histories. Picasso was only one of the guys doing clay. Miro, the whole Cobra group, Gauguin. I mean, clay has always been there. Liechtenstein, Malevich. I mean, clay has always been there, and people have always made work out of it. Hannah Wilke made a great series out of using clay. So, yeah, I think a lot of people who are trained in clay, it's part of being marginalized. And I don't want to draw too much of a parallel between cultural marginalization and colonial attitudes and what we experience as artists, but there's a mentality there that I think is similar. And the fact is that we form these camps, and people who we try to decide whether are you a potter or a ceramist or a ceramic artist or a ceramicist have had a particular kind of training and studied particular histories, and people that don't call themselves those things have studied other histories. Now, in the university, art history is what it is, so the people who are using clay as a material study the more mainstream history, but they never see themselves reflected in it, even though every one of those artists, I mean, Gauguin in particular, I think, is very importantly connected to things that we see happening now. And this is where mainstream, I'm going to call it mainstream art, has sort of realized that, like, hey, we can go back and remine our own history and take this other trajectory that includes clay. And the people that have been trained in clay, that have been sort of like occupying this other sort of sector, are kind of going like, hey, like, well, I can do that. I have access to that too. What does that make me? Or so, I think that's part of how those lines break down. But the point being is that, yeah, Picasso was prolific at everything and made a lot of molds, and they're still producing some of the things that he made out of molds. It's all licensed.
Yeah.
But yeah, all of the artists that you love have all worked with clay at one point or another.
Veering back into the show itself, I've noticed that the larger room has more non-utilitarian pieces, whereas the smaller room has more vessels, utilitarian pieces. Are there any thoughts on this division in the show? And is this a separation, the non-utilitarian versus the utilitarian that exists in your field? Did any of you notice that the show is set up with vessels in one room and mostly non-utilitarian pieces in the larger room?
Oh, everyone's looking at me. I mean, we talked about this at dinner the other night about just the logistics of scale in relationship to where things are placed in the show. And I obviously wasn't the preparator and I wasn't the curator and didn't really have control over those decisions. But I do think that work between the two rooms share such a common language and a common idea, and to kind of get back to the idea of currents and headwaters and sources. I think about sort of the common ideas between for instance, my work on the wall and Yuan Dong's piece, and sharing a language of painting and drawing and ephemerality, and in the same space, thinking about Julia Galloway's pots in the other room and her idea of endangered species and the connection between us and living organisms, and building urns that are a symbol of hope and preservation. I think about in memory in my own work the idea of preservation. So there's threads, even though we would say that the utilitarianism kind of dominates the smaller room. There's still threads of that, even in the large room in the sculpture. I think about the commonalities between Pattie and I's work and the overlap of memory. So maybe it is just a logistical circumstance.
I agree with that. I think the idea of how it's separated is just a way to put them together. And I think that for me, I think, oh, well, it's like a party, and all of these people are at the party, and some of them have gathered in the kitchen, and the other ones have gathered in the living room, and they're having a conversation. And maybe sometimes the kitchen people want to go to the living room and hang out with the other people, but they're probably more comfortable in that other space. And that's not to say that one or the other is the kitchen or the living room, but I do think that there's, for me, I was just looking at the show. I was looking at the show. I was looking at the show just now, and I think that the idea of the table and the tabletop in terms of how we think of utilitarian vessels in that space, and not a lot of the work in the other space seems to make sense to be on a table space. So that makes sense in some ways. But I also was looking at it from the entrance point, and we had been talking about the tables at dinner the other night. And I think what was interesting to me is that we were talking about the tables before I saw the tables. And so when I saw the tables, I was surprised in a way how different it was than my mind was imagining it. And for me, when I look at it now, I sort of see it as this topographic space. And I see a lot of the work in that space as being landscape relational. There's a sense of place and space in those vessels. Not all of them, but I mean, there's nature there, and there's landscape. The vessels on the tables become landmarks on a map or on a topographical map for me, which become interesting. I think also, again, table and landscape, as in La Mesa, the table, or the scale of things being small and large. And I think you can lose smaller objects next to bigger objects. And there are quite a few pots on that little table that I made. So there you go. There's some vessels right there in the show. But yeah, that's my view, is that I think that it's just a conversation. And I think it could have been different, but I don't know that it would have been better. It just would have been different. And I don't know that it talks about hierarchy, really.
Yeah, your metaphor is just perfect, because there are conversations that overlap, and yeah, I relate to that a lot. There were 3 curators, right? So Brenda Lichman and Ksenia Gerstein and myself. And so any show, right, but particularly a show like this that uses the material, the medium, as the sort of the tie that binds the work together. There's always, any show has this very real negotiation that has to happen. There's only so much space, how many works of a particular kind. So the concept of a show, when the rubber meets the road, when it hits the real world, and things have to change and compromises have to be made, so if that space, if we could just get rid of that wall between the 2 galleries, what would the show look like then? But the fact is, we have this space, and we have this much work, and with Ksenia and Brenda and myself, each having our own passions and interests and attachments and feelings of how ceramics is best represented and presented. So we had to sort of negotiate these things. And the one thing that I'll say is that, yeah, I can see how it looks a lot like there's functional work here and not functional work here. And as much as I could walk you through and point out sort of things that don't fall into those lines, mainly what we wanted to do is figure out the best way to honor all of the work. And work that happens at a particular scale is very hard to put. I can't imagine putting Liz Quackenbush's white chicken jar next to Yuen Dong's wall painted piece, they wouldn't complement each other, but they both have so much that's important to say. And where those works are now, I mean, I get goosebumps thinking about how much I love what's happening around that. And I think that's a matter of scale and a matter of context. And so tables and shelves, sort of wanting to evoke a little bit more of that intimacy in the space. You know, could the tables be smaller and we could have a little more space to walk around? But then, you know, that galley kitchen, you know, where you have to kind of scoot along and not, you know, how many butts fit in a kitchen, right? So there's a feeling about the space there and the space that's given to the pots. So I feel really successful as a co-curator with my collaborators on why we made those choices and why we did it the way that we did. But it's really hard to escape. There's so much that needs to be negotiated in all of that we didn't maybe win on every score. But I would say, you know, that's part of the fun and the challenge of it, is figuring out how these conversations happen within the discipline, the field of ceramics as a whole, so that it's all there and it all makes sense, but it's like, it's so different. You know, how do you put Yuen Dong next to Liz Quackenbush? Like, how do you do that?
Yeah.
And yet we go to the similar schools and get similar training.
Right.
I just want to add one other thing, and I think it's really easy to believe that it's a hierarchical choice, that one group goes one place because it's lesser in some way. But I would question which is the lesser of those two exhibition spaces, which is the lesser work. I mean, I think that they both have extremely strong work in them. I feel really lucky to be in the exhibition with Trisha and the other people that are in my space. I would have felt equally honored to be placed with the other people in the other show, but I can see where maybe Chris Guston's big undulating bowl wouldn't have made as much sense next to my piece as it would next to the pieces that it's like next to Julia Galloway's work, or some of the vessel forms, because it then becomes a conversation about vessels. So it is sort of like a train of thought or some ideas and talking about things between those things that is important to me. I think that people want to try and go this or that, better or worse, higher or lower. And I feel like there is like this, it's not all about judging in that way. There's so much competition. It's not about a judgment, I don't think. That's not how I view it. I view it as just, this makes sense in this context, these things together. And again, because of it's two separate rooms, it just works out that way.
Good. When you get a painter as your moderator, you get painting references. So painting has been declared dead several times in the past, fairly recent history, and maybe led to different avenues like the pop art movement, or video art pieces, or installation work, so on and so forth. What drives the ceramic art form, and where do you see the art form going in the future?
Do you think that painting was declared dead because, and then those things came from it, or painting was declared dead because those pieces came?
That's a good question.
You want the question, Rick? My question was, what came first, basically? It was painting declared dead, and then pop art happened, and then video art happened? Or did video art happen, and pop art happen, and all these other movements happened that were different than traditional art, and that's why painting was declared dead? I mean, I wonder.
I'm asking you, do these... No, come on over here. I'm wondering if there are undulations that are big in your field of art that have transformed where the art form has gone, and where do you see your art form moving in the future?
I'm gonna say that it's really because ceramics is technology based. If you think about that, we can make new kinds of art, but it still goes in the kiln next to the other kinds of art. And so the idea of this, because painting also declares itself triumphant periodically, the triumph of American painting over what and whom, right? So those are But you know, ceramics, the technology has always been the same. And even though we see there's 3D printed clay now, so it's possible to print clay material through a computer-controlled 3D printer, the way that you do with plastic and things like this. And so, you know, that work, yeah, as new, does that replace the old? I don't think, and most people that I know that are working with it love the aberrations and the idiosyncrasies of the failures of technology, the errors, the misprints, but they also, at some point, have to handle the thing. So it's never hands-free, and so the material understanding is still intrinsic. The tacit knowledge that we have as makers is still brought to bear on the decision making. We have this internal sense of the material, even though this is a very sort of hands-off kind of process. And so I think what's true in ceramics, I'm gonna go ahead and say this, whether it's true or not. It's my story. I'm sticking to it. But because of the relationship to technology, new technologies never eliminate or erase old technologies. They incorporate them. The old technologies are always there, and I think that's more like ceramics. It's not this sort of this complete casting off of the old in favor of the new. Those conversations become much more fluid, and if there's any kind of a continuum, I don't see it in terms of a continuum of practice back to the early history of the material. I don't feel connected to the first potter, but I do feel connected to ideas that I see people trying to work out with the material and how they solve those problems. And I see that with newer technologies as much as older technologies. Being a traditional, coming from an interest in traditional Japanese wood-fired ceramics, but also this intense interest in these new technologies. So I feel like I see it all happening at the same time in a way that I don't know that I see painting experiencing itself in that way.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think as long as there are human beings exploring the human connections through a material, there's always going to be people who are exploring that sense of touch and that sense of connectivity that our material is really good with dealing with. I think as the communication changes of technology, it makes room for that too. But I don't see those original questions and the original engagement with the material going away either. I mean, we always are going to have touch. We're always going to have feel and taste and sight. And so, ceramics are going to still continue to touch on all of those really elemental ways of relating among humans.
Yeah, and I think again, I agree with what Trisha and Ted was saying. I think the idea that clay is a material more than a style or a type. And so when they were talking about painting being dead, maybe it's about a certain traditional type of painting. Well, people have been doing all kinds of different things with clay. I mean, there's clay paintings in the gallery on the wall. And there's installation work that people do. There's performance. There's videos, whatever. Like there's all these different ways that people use clay. So as a material, it's really has a lot of opportunity to do different things. So I think in the same way that painting has shifted and people's focus within art has shifted to different ways of using paint or not paint, I think people shift the way that they think about using clay and how they move around and through and with clay in their work. Does that make sense?
It does, absolutely. I think at this time we could probably turn it over to questions that the audience might have. Does anyone have a question they'd like to ask the artists? Yes, ma'am.
I'm curious, like you've all picked a certain kind of clay that you use. Did you pick that clay because it did what you told it to do, or once you started, did it lead you down a different avenue?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I'm necessarily using one form of the material. I think with this particular body of work, I started with porcelain just because of its representation in still life painting and worth and value. But the work in the other room is mostly all stoneware, which I know we're getting kind of nitpicky within the material in the field itself. But I'm sorry, what was the original question? I'm kind of getting off track a little. Yeah. Yeah.
You wanted to do, or once you started, did it kind of lead you on a different
A little bit of both. I mean, I think about the visuality of the work in there, and so it's slip in its liquid form, and the shards of the fired clay, and sort of everything, the fragments and the whole pieces in there, I think help dictate the work. And then when the kilns are unloaded, sometimes that leads to the next way of exploring the material.
I use about 5 different clay bodies, and yes, it is about which one works best for each different thing that I do, and I think the thing that's the worst thing about it is that then you have to keep them separate if they're high fire and low fire. But for my figures, I use a clay that I know will stand up in the firing, that it's not going to melt in a way that I don't want it to, and it's the right color for underneath the glazes to be what I want it to be. But yeah, the clay I will choose the clay, or the clay chooses me, and I move sort of between what those things are, and I change the clay depending on what thing I move to. Yeah.
I'm pretty curious about material, and so I'm pretty promiscuous that way. I just kind of like try something out, and I try to work with it on its own terms and see what I can do with it. There's very little that I have in mind, like, sometimes there is, but not usually something that like, I need it to do this, so I can only have this clay and I will only use this clay. But for me as a curator too, I think, and I hope the viewers to this show will go through and ask that exact question. I think you can say, why did this artist choose this particular clay, which is different than this clay that this person is using? And when you do see a similar clay, like if you see a white clay, why are they using it so differently? Because clays have physical properties. They're good for building large things or small things or smooth things or rough things, but they also have histories. They have color, right, which have emotional associations, but they have histories. Porcelain originates in China, and it's very rare, and there were wars fought for it. People died, people were imprisoned and tortured to discover that it was more valuable than gold. It has a very specific place in world history as a material of value, and an economic material, but it also has that sense of purity and fragility and value. So the meanings that are inherent into these materials, artists choose that material for all of those things: color, meaning, workability, personal preference.
I was going to say, the porcelain, it's also your toilet. So it's like these valuable things, and your toilet's valuable too, I guess. But
so I think, as we move through the exhibition, that's such a great question to ask, and I hope that you'll try to decipher that and think about, put yourself in the artist's shoes to figure out what's going on in there. It's a great question.
So a kind of quick and dirty search of Painting is Dead produced a French painter named Delaroche, who in 1840 saw a photograph and said, "Painting is dead." And it appears that it's been pronounced dead every decade since. The same search, without quotes, "Pottery is dead," produced no results except for a long list of potters who had died. So it would appear there's never been a replacement mode for pottery. It's not really a question, but I'm curious.
I think, the relationship to the idea of tradition. This is there's Brenda. You can watch Fiddler on the Roof. Tradition, right?
tradition.
The relationship of the medium, or at least the way that we're trained in the medium, the way that it's taught in the U.S. and in Europe also. A lot of that's changing in Europe, but I know in England, the relationship to studio pottery through World War II, post-World War II, is very specific. And so the idea of a tradition being a living thing, the traditions are alive, or I like to think of them that way. I prefer them that way. So to take ideas that we didn't originate ourselves and to engage them and to see if there's still something new that can come from that without breaking that tie, I think is very much a part of, it's sort of baked into contemporary American studio ceramics. And I see so many movements, like especially the futurists. I mean, it was a fascist movement, right? But the idea that the world is going to be reborn, out of fire into this new thing, I think the parameters are just different that way, I think. And I don't know that I've ever seen any attitudes in the history of ceramics or even contemporary ceramics, even the most sort of contemporary practitioners now. I don't see a lot of desire to break away from. I hear a lot of this artist uses clay in a way that transcends the material. This idea of transcending the material, and I'm not sure. There's a lot to unpack there that I don't get, but I don't hear a lot of like death of pottery, or no matter what people have done to it, poked holes in it, turned it upside down.
As an artist who primarily works with paint, I think a lot about the communal atmosphere that has always been my understanding of the ceramics world, and just always been a little jealous of it, to be honest. Like, and I can think a little bit about like the technology and just kind of the efforts to run a studio and to kind of commune around certain equipment and things like that. But I'm just wondering, like today, if you could speak to that sense of community that seems to exist in the ceramics world in a way it doesn't exist maybe always with other medias, and maybe what sustains it even today.
I think the idea of community is one of the most beautiful things of our field. It reminds me of being up at NCCA, our annual conference last March, and seeing, I don't know if you guys caught the show, where there was a literal big piece of paper with just Warren Mackenzie's name on there, and everyone was drawing connections of how they connected to that one particular potter. And you could look at that piece of paper and probably everyone could pick out someone that they knew that then had a connection to someone else that had a connection to this original potter. That's a really rare thing in our field. And I think it's a beautiful thing. You can walk throughout the two galleries and it's that it doesn't take 7 degrees of so-and-so to have a connection to the work that's in there. I think the size of the field helps with that a little bit.
I'm 2 degrees. I went to grad school in Minnesota, where he was from. Yeah, I think the community is interesting. I was in printmaking before I was in ceramics, and there seemed to be a community when I first was in printmaking because there was 5 majors in the area, and then I was the only major in my thesis year, so it was kind of lonely. I think that the community is really rich, and that codependence can be really rewarding. But I think that people are willing to help each other out. I think things like wood fires really show that. Like you get all these people that come together to work together. And I think that it draws people who are interested in that, because if you want to be on your own in your studio working, it's hard to do that. Like my grads in my program, we're always making them do things together, so they have to kind of get along. I mean, I know it sounds like I'm being a fascist myself, but I just think that you're going to get much further in life and in this world if you build bridges rather than be isolationist. And so yeah, I think it's terrific, and I love being around people. I love teaching, and for that reason, it's great to be in a community that likes to be together and sharing.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I think about here at Wichita State, ceramics in general, but my experience of that at Wichita State since I've been here, community's always been strong. I think Wichita has a really strong sense of community. It's been strong in the ceramics department, but especially since Brenda Lichman has been here. She is the sunshine that has grown that garden into something abundant and fertile and giving. And when I think about like how and why that happens, and we need each other, right? We form communities because we need each other, because we need help. We can't do it all on our own. And so we have people that help us do things. And ceramics is like that. We have kilns. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of equipment. There's a lot of heavy lifting. Like we need other people to help us do our own thing. Also, pottery, you got to eat out of that stuff and might as well have a meal together. So I think there are some things that lend themselves to that idea of community. But I think also being somewhat out of the mainstream of information sharing. So sharing technology, Art in America doesn't share tips and tricks for people trying to make this stuff. Likewise, it doesn't necessarily have the same the information that everybody's looking for where to find shows or to get good deals on materials. So there's also an information network sharing. So we share in labor, we share information, and those are the things that build community. Ceramics is particularly good at it, but I see that happening in music. I see that happening in Wichita in general. I think there are so many great ways to do that. And like I say, I mean, what Brenda has done is capitalized on that and her concern for food security issues and hunger awareness in general, but specifically here in Wichita. So the way that those things come together, hunger awareness and ceramics and Wichita is a particularly beautiful example of that. And I think that includes everybody. I think, you know, we can't do it without people that don't do clay, painters and that sort of thing. And that's a Wichita thing, I think. But we should build communities because we need each other.
I want to add one more thing. It's a really big table. You're welcome. Come on up. It doesn't have to be clay. I think the thing I find that my students are always wondering why the painters and printmakers and sculptors and whoever, why they don't join them in the kind of community. And I think that for them is like, that's the thing that they miss a lot in school and after school. There are people who do, but generally it's ceramic and ceramic. Yeah.
Well, our time is limited. I'd like to thank you all for coming. I'd like to thank Pattie Chalmers for traveling and being at this wonderful exhibit and for her work. Trisha Coates for her wonderful work and joining us today. And Ted Adler for his work and joining us today. I think they're all three just brilliant. We've been lucky. I'd like to thank Jenna Irwin for the invitation and for putting this together. She's a marvelous host, and the Ulrichs as well, which I love with all my heart. Thank you for coming here on such a beautiful Saturday. The galleries are open. Feel free, and hope you look around. Thank you for coming. Bye-bye. Thank you.